Now we will work on the practice exercise for editing geometry. We want to select the river road geometry and observe the manipulators and the handlers. Notice there are no manipulators or handlers in the section, the geometry, where microstation graphics were imported into the complex geometry. Microstation graphics does not have rules, so there's no manipulators or handlers. This section of the geometry cannot be changed as it exists. Before we apply rules to the microstation graphics to fix the problem, let's explore how the design intent influenced the rest of the geometry. You can zoom in to the two curves, and on the first curve, you'll notice that the rules are created in a way that I've got a point of intersection, and I can actually grab that PI and move it. And this was created using the simple arc command. On the second curve, you'll notice that this one was created using simple arc from element, and so we can actually go in and edit the bearing on that exit. It has an exit direction. We don't have a PI, but we have an exit direction. So there's different manipulators and handlers for different curves that we create using horizontal geometry. Now if we go in and change the radius for the first curve to 1000 and observe the changes, so I'm going to come here to my radius value, click on it, and type in 1000 and hit enter on my keyboard. It'll immediately update those changes and apply them, and I can see that the tangents before and after have the same bearing, and the curve is really the only thing that changed. And if we go and do the same for the second curve, we change that radius to 1000, key that in and hit enter. The curve changes to the new radius as expected, but the geometry also changed significantly down station. This is not an error. The software maintained our design intent to have a 1550-foot arc length. The only way to maintain this arc length is to adjust the curve's exit bearing. And we can also change the arc length for the second curve. So instead of 1550, we can change that to 500. Key that in and hit enter. And that shortens up the curve greatly, but kind of moves it back near where we were. But really, we didn't want to make any of these changes. We just wanted to observe how those changes would manipulate the geometry. So I'm going to do an edit undo, or Control Z, and undo the previous three changes. And then we're going to drop this element and go back and modify the microstation graphics and make those ruled. So I want to go to drop element, and click on this element, and now it's dropped back to what it was before I created the complex geometry. I can see my pieces of civil geometry, and I've also got my microstation element over here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to select the Create Civil Rule feature down here, the horizontal geometry tools towards the bottom. We want to create a civil rule feature out of this microstation graphic, this purple line. So I'm going to left click to click on that, and right click to complete. And that's it. So now this is all promoted up to a civil geometry element. Next, we will insert the curve between the geometry elements we created earlier and the microstation graphics we promoted. So insert a curve here. I'm going to go to my simple arc command, left click on the first, and then locate the second element, and we want to put in a radius. I want to have a locked in radius. I'm going to type in a radius of 2580, key that in and hit enter on my keyboard, and it creates the curve. I can left click to accept and continue, and then it asks to trim extend. I'm going to trim both of those tangents and create a curve there. So hit trim both, left click to cycle through that, and we'll notice that even though the trim / extend was set to both, the ruled microstation graphics wasn't trimmed, so we'll need to do this manually. I'm going to go back and trim this line by using my trim to element command, my microstation commands over here under number 7, trim to element, and we want to click on the line that we're going to trim, but we want to click on it in the portion that we want to keep. So I want to keep this line on this end of it, and I want to cut it using this curve. So I left click, my second click will identify the cutting element, so I click on the curve and it trims this tangent. Now we can go back and complex the entire, creating my horizontal geometry and giving it a name of River Road. So I've got all the pieces in here, they're all ruled and they all have design intent on them. And so bringing that together on my complex by elements button, I'll click here and we're going to automatically create River Road. So I type in my feature name of River Road using my active feature definition. So I have road underbar centerline set as my active feature definition. That's what's going to get created. And I'm going to click at the very beginning of my first tangent, left click on that. It highlights all the way down that path and make sure everything's highlighted. Okay, looks good. Left click again to accept the complex geometry, and we've created River Road again. So even under civil model I can see somewhere in here there should be a River Road complex element that we've created. But if I click on this, I can see it all in one piece, and if I zoom in you can see my handlers and manipulators. The entire geometry now has rules. We can also use design standards, and so I'm going to go to my design standards toolbar. Over here under horizontal geometry, the very first button is my design standards toolbar. I'll click on that and I can dock that up at the top, but I'll just leave it right here. And I want to choose a design standard, my active design standard. I'm going to set it to 2-lane, 6% super elevation. Click on the plus sign there and then highlight 65 miles per hour. Select that and I can see my design standard here, 2-lane, 6% super elevation, 65 miles per hour. And on these two buttons I can toggle as active. As I'm creating something, it would actively try to create those design standards, but a lot of times it's better to apply these after you've created everything. So we're going to set the design standard. Click on that button on the left. I'm going to set the design standard for this geometry here. So I'm going to select River Road. And you can zoom in. Some of these turns you might see an error, or you might see warnings. You have to be zoomed in at a certain level to actually see those icons. And if we go over here to element information, well, first I need to select this geometry. So element selection, select my geometry, and on River Road I can see under my element information that 2-lane, 6% super, 65 mile per hour design standard is now part of that element. We also want to go and look at our civil message center, and the civil message center would give us our warnings or errors down here at the bottom. And right now I've got highlighted microstation errors, warnings, and messages, so you can deselect those. They're just toggling these on and off. So if I want just my errors, I click on errors. If I want my warnings underneath that, I can have that on as well. And so that you see the error arc radius is less than minimum, and that's because it is using a value of 1650 when the design standard is 1660. Everything else is just warnings, but I really maybe want to go and zoom into this error and maybe fix it. So I was already zoomed in a bit, but even if I'm zoomed out, I can right click on this error and zoom to. It will zoom in real close so we can actually see the curve. So we know which one it is. It's this curve right here. and it has a radius of 1650. Okay, I'm going to change that, so I'm going to click on this radius, and I'm going to change it to 1750. Type that in and hit enter on my keyboard. It changes the radius, and you'll also notice that in the Civil Message Center that error disappears. So I no longer have any errors, just have my warnings. I'll close my Design Standards toolbar, and we'll continue with vertical geometry next.